I was standing in the dairy aisle of the supermarket yesterday, and I was watching this man who, he looks like he was trying very hard to be health conscious. He had the expensive workout gear on, checking his smartwatch, clearly someone who cares about his body.
Right, he's tracking his metrics.
Exactly. And he's holding a carton of farm fresh eggs in one hand, and in the other, a box of low-fat breakfast cereal.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
He looks at the eggs, and he makes this face, this grimace of genuine fear, and he mutters, "Can't do it. The cholesterol is a killer."
Wow. Still.
And he puts the eggs back on the shelf like they were radioactive. Then, with this sense of moral victory, he tosses the processed cereal into his cart.
The safe choice in his mind.
The safe choice.
Yeah.
So I glanced at the box he chose. The second ingredient was sugar. Then refined vegetable oils and a list of chemicals I couldn't even pronounce. But to him, that zero cholesterol label on the front was all that mattered.
So that's the power of marketing right there.
It gets crazier. He actually caught me looking, saw the jar of ghee in my basket, and gave me this pitying, almost condescending look.
Oh, no.
He says, "You know that stuff clogs your arteries, right? My doctor told me to cut all saturated fats if I want to live past 50.
And he's just trying to follow what he thinks is the best advice.
He is. But here's the tragic irony that really struck me. This guy looked exhausted. His skin was puffy. He had that distinct look of chronic inflammation, and he just seemed to be running on nervous energy, not real vitality.
Classic signs.
Yeah, classic sign of the very metabolic issues he was trying so desperately to avoid. He was terrified of the exact nutrient his brain and hormones were probably screaming for while he's filling his cart with the sugar and processed oils that were actually destroying his health.
And he thinks he's following medical advice.
He thinks he's following medical advice, but as I watched him walk away, I realized he's just following a marketing campaign from the 1970s.
That's it, exactly.
That interaction, that fear of natural fats, and then at the same time, this casual consumption of processed inflammatory foods. That is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. That shoppers' fear of a natural, whole food, the egg, while he's embracing refined carbs, it represents this massive, decades-long misunderstanding in public health.
It really does.
So our mission today is kind of twofold. First, we need to trace where this profound confusion even started. Specifically, how a calculated strategic marketing effort successfully painted fat as the sole villain back in the 60s.
And then
we have to compare that, that outdated view with the cutting-edge scientific consensus that places chronic inflammation, far more than dietary cholesterol or even specific fats, at the absolute core of cardiovascular risk.
And what's fascinating here is just how sticky those old ideas are, how pervasive they remain. You nail the diagnosis right at the start. Consumers are focused on single nutrient targets.
Cholesterol, fat grams.
Exactly. Cholesterol, fat grams. Because that's the story that dominated the public health world for, 50 years? But focusing just on let's call it the plumbing model of cholesterol control, it's just not enough. It's actually dangerous.
How so?
Well, if you're avoiding nutrient-dense, really satiating fats, stuff in eggs, nuts, avocados, only to replace them with refined carbs and added sugar.
Which is what everyone did.
It's what everyone did.
Right.
And you're just fueling the metabolic dysfunction and that low-grade chronic inflammation that truly drives heart disease. So we have to correct this historical record to help you, the listener, grasp the real modifiable drivers of heart health today.
Okay, so to understand why half the supermarket is still plastered with low-fat labels, we have to go back. We need to rewind to the middle of the 20th century. After World War II, rates of heart disease, specifically coronary heart disease, were just soaring in the U.S. and the West. And this led scientists to scramble for some kind of dietary explanation.
Yeah, this was the moment of the great nutrition debate, really, the 1950s and 60s. It was a true scientific battleground.
And there were two main camps, right?
Primarily, yes, two opposing schools of thought. On one side, you had Ancel. He was a hugely influential physiologist, and Keyes was the champion of what we call the diet heart hypothesis.
Which stated what?
He was asserting that high total fat, saturated fat, and especially dietary cholesterol were the primary culprits. They were what led to atherosclerosis and coronary heart disease. His work was absolutely pivotal in establishing that fat is bad doctrine.
Okay, so that's one side. Who's on the other?
On the other side was a British physiologist named John Yudkin, and he looked at the exact same data, the same soaring disease rates, and he pointed the finger squarely at something else.
Sugar.
Added sugars. Sucrose. Yudkin argued that sugar was the primary dietary agent driving all of these cardiovascular and metabolic problems.
So you have this clear conflict. Fat versus sugar? How did it play out?
Well, the scientific waters were muddy for a while, but by the 1980s, when the U.S. government released its first official dietary guidelines, the fat hypothesis had basically won the policy debate.
It became official doctrine.
It became official. These guidelines placed a heavy, heavy emphasis on reducing total fat, saturated fat, and dietary cholesterol to prevent heart disease. And that official adoption, it successfully marginalized and really sidelined Yudkin's urgent warnings about sugar for an entire generation.
But when you dig into the source material, the deeper dive reveals this wasn't just a simple case of one hypothesis winning out on pure scientific merit, was it?
Not even close. It was a narrative that was deliberately shaped by a powerful external influence. It was a strategic campaign orchestrated by the sugar industry itself.
And this work, it's really interesting. The internal documents from the Sugar Research Foundation, the SRF, they provide this crucial, almost unbelievable historical record.
And their motivations were transparently economic. I mean, there's no hiding it. As early as 1954, their leadership, including the president, Henry Haas, articulated a very clear business strategy.
Which was?
Promoting a low-fat diet was the key to increasing sugar's market share.
Okay, let's just break down that calculation because it's chillingly effective.
It really is.
The SRF realized that if they could convince Americans to embrace a low-fat diet, those last fat calories, they would have to be replaced by something else.
Right, you have to eat something.
You have to eat something, primarily carbohydrates. So they calculated that if Americans replaced just 20% of their fat calories with carbs, and if sugar could just maintain its existing share of that carb market, sugar consumption would increase by over a third.
Over a third. The motivation wasn't health. It was about maximizing profit by making sugar the necessary non-fat substitute in the entire national diet.
It's an incredible business plan.
A brilliant business plan. And that strategy was put into action immediately because the industry was acutely aware of the existential threat posed by scientists like Yudkin.
They saw him coming.
They saw him coming. By the early 60s, internal SRF memos show this rising concern. In December of 64, John Hickson, who was the director of research, he noted the flowing reports that were suggesting sugar was a less desirable source of calories than other carbs, and he specifically cited Yudkin.
And Hickson's response wasn't to, fund objective science to find the truth.
Oh, no. It was an unambiguous call to action. He wrote that the SRF should embark on a major program to counter these negative attitudes. He suggested they fund research specifically intended to refute our detractors.
So they moved from just observing to actively commissioning advocacy, but disguising it as impartial science.
Precisely. And this political maneuvering led directly to something called Project 226 in 1965.
What was the catalyst for that? What made them act so quickly?
It was the publication of articles in the Annals of Internal Medicine that were linking sucrose directly to coronary heart disease, specifically showing it aggravated hypertriglyceridemia, which is a known risk factor.
High triglycerides.
High triglycerides. And an editorial that accompanied the articles argued that if elevated serum triglycerides were a risk factor, then, quote, sucrose must be atherogenic.
Atherogenic, meaning it causes plaque in the arteries.
Exactly.
So the sugar industry must have felt the walls closing in.
They panicked. Just 2 days after a major newspaper ran a full-page article on this new research, threatening to expose the role of sugar, the SRF Executive Committee approved Project 226. It was a rapid, purely defensive move.
And what was Project 226 exactly?
Ostensibly, it was a literature review on carbohydrates and cholesterol metabolism. They commissioned D. Mark Hegsted and Robert McGandy, 2 Harvard researchers who were overseen by Frederick Stairs.
Harvard. That gives it a lot of credibility.
A huge amount of credibility. And the funding was significant for 1965, $6,500.
Which is what, today?
It adjusts to the equivalent of nearly $49,000 today. But honestly, the money is less damning than the explicit instructions that the SRF gave the researchers.
Okay, let's hear them.
Hickson, the SRF vice president, was incredibly explicit in his letter to Hegsted. He stated, and I'm quoting here, their particular interest had to do with that part of nutrition in which there are claims that carbohydrates in the form of sucrose make an inordinate contribution to the metabolic condition hitherto ascribed to aberrations called fat metabolism.
Wow. So he's basically saying, hey, we're paying you to write a review that proves sugar isn't the problem, fat is.
That's it. He even demanded that this specific goal should not be drowned out in a cascade of review and general interpretation. He wanted a targeted hit piece on the anti-sugar science.
That is the ultimate smoking gun.
It really is. The SRF dictated the objective to ensure the outcome was predetermined to be favorable to sugar. And what's more, the internal communications show that Hickson actively inserted himself into the research process. He was vetting articles, providing material for the researchers to critique, specifically material that contained findings that were threatening to sugar sales.
So he was hand-feeding them the studies to tear down, and the researchers themselves, they felt this pressure.
Oh, clearly. Hegstad wrote to the SRF in 1966, and he detailed how every time the Iowa group, who were big sugar researchers, published a paper linking sugar to heart disease, they had to, quote, rework a section in rebuttal.
It sounds less like research and more like a PR campaign.
It was an ongoing struggle to frame the scientific literature as a pro-sugar argument. They were essentially operating as high-paid advocates, not as impartial reviewers.
So when this two-part review was finally published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, a very esteemed journal.
Very esteemed. It perfectly served the SRF's interests. It minimized all the evidence linking sugar to negative metabolic outcomes. And it effectively concluded that there was, quote, no doubt that the only dietary intervention necessary to prevent heart disease was reducing dietary cholesterol and replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. The entire focus was locked on to fat.
And the single most critical detail in all of this.
The SRF's funding, their objective setting, their explicit role in directing the study's conclusion, none of it was disclosed.
Not to the public.
Not to the public, not to the journal, not to the wider scientific community. It was a complete secret. And it successfully steered the entire scientific and public conversation away from sugar and locked the focus onto fat and cholesterol for decades to come.
Directly influencing the shopper we saw in the dairy aisle 50 years later.
Directly.
So the low-fat message becomes gospel. Throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, we're all told to fear butter, embrace margarine, avoid eggs, and load up on low-fat everything.
Which, of course, inevitably meant high sugar and high refined carb everything.
So what was the quantifiable result of this great caloric trade-off?
The outcome was, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, a public health catastrophe. If you look at the national data from 1971 onward, fat intake in the U.S. did drop. It moved from about 36.6% of total calories down to about 33.6%.
Okay, so a 3% drop.
Right. But that 3% of calories had to go somewhere. And it was replaced almost entirely by a corresponding increase in carbohydrate intake.
And the public wasn't making quality substitutions here. It's not like they were swapping butter for kale.
No, they were swapping it for cheap, processed starches and sugar. And this shift had several really devastating consequences.
That's the first one.
First, it encouraged the avoidance of extremely nutrient-dense foods that are rich in healthy, unsaturated fats.
Right.
We're talking about nuts, seeds, avocados, certain vegetable oils, foods that we now know are highly protective.
Okay, so we threw out the good with the bad.
Exactly. Second, it led to a massive overconsumption of refined carbohydrates and added sugars. And perhaps most critically, removing fat, which is the most satiating macronutrient from the diet, meant that people felt less full after meals.
Right, the Snackwell's phenomenon. You could eat a whole box of fat-free cookies and still be hungry.
And you did. People had to eat more food to feel satisfied, which contributed to the significant increase in total energy intake, and it triggered the explosion of obesity rates across the United States. The low-fat solution became the foundation of the modern metabolic crisis.
That mechanistic connection is so important. It wasn't just that the sugar was bad on its own, but the lack of fat destroyed satiety, making sure people ate in excess of the cheap, sugary substitute.
It's a double whammy of metabolic disruption. It absolutely is. And modern nutrition science has had to spend the last 2 decades basically correcting the errors of that entire era.
Which brings us to this critical idea of substitution quality.
Yes. The simplistic rule that saturated fat is inherently bad is just fundamentally flawed because the effect is entirely dependent on the food you use to replace it with.
So if we look at the contemporary data, what happens when you replace saturated fat with, say, total carbohydrates, which is what the whole country did?
The data it's starkly clear. Large pooling studies, meta-analyses, they all show that replacing saturated fat with refined carbohydrates or added sugars, the exact trade-off that defined the low-fat era, It yields absolutely no benefit on cardiovascular disease risk.
No benefit.
No benefit. In fact, some analyses suggest this substitution actually increases the risk of coronary events. One major pooling project found that substituting saturated fat with total carbs was associated with a hazard ratio of 1.07 for coronary events.
So about 7% higher risk.
A higher risk, so the refined sugar that took the place of the fat was actively more damaging than the fat it replaced.
That's the core conclusion, isn't it?
It is. The health effect hinges entirely on the replacement nutrient. If you replace that same saturated fat with high-quality polyunsaturated fat, or PUFA, the kind you find in nuts, seeds, some vegetable oils, you consistently reduce cardiovascular disease risk.
Is there a number on that?
Yeah, studies show that replacing just 5% of energy from saturated fat with PUFA correlates with a statistically significant 10% decrease in coronary heart disease risk.
So tiny changes, big impact.
Huge impact. But substituting it with refined starch and sugar, zero benefit, and it likely increases your risk by driving insulin resistance and chronic inflammation.
It's just fascinating how that 1967 Harvard review so successfully steered the conversation away from sugar by presenting this false dichotomy.
It was brilliant in a way.
They argued we must replace saturated fat, but they conveniently ignored the mechanism of substitution. They didn't seem to consider that the public would replace nutrient-dense fat with cheap, hyperpalatable, nutrient-poor carbohydrates.
Which is exactly what fueled the crisis we're now facing. And that influence created the public guidance that endured for decades. The focus was on limiting an entire class of food fat without equally emphasizing the need to replace it with high-quality nutrients, or even more importantly, strictly limiting the refined starches and sugars.
And the shopper we started with is just living proof of this lasting confusion.
Absolutely. Terrified of the natural food that brings satiety and essential building blocks, yet happily consuming the packaged food that guarantees metabolic disruption.
So this brings us to the new science. The conversation in modern cardiology has moved so far past this simple focus on LDL cholesterol. We're not just concerned with the plumbing model of clogged pipes anymore.
No, not at all.
The cutting-edge consensus now centers on fire, on chronic inflammation, as the chief driver of cardiovascular events.
That shift it's profound. I mean, for decades, the entire therapeutic landscape was driven by this idea that heart disease was just cholesterol passively accumulating and blocking arteries.
And statins were the answer.
Statins were the key intervention to lower LDL cholesterol. And look, they worked well to reduce risk. There's no denying that. However, clinical trials also showed that a significant residual risk persisted, even when LDL was brought down to optimal level.
A residual risk.
A residual risk. And that risk, we now understand, is primarily driven by chronic low-grade inflammation. This is the persistent, active, and modifiable driver of atherosclerosis, plaque rupture, and heart attacks.
So if cholesterol levels are sort of the foundation, inflammation is the persistent stressor that destabilizes the whole structure.
That's a great way to put it.
How do clinicians identify this residual inflammatory risk in a patient?
The standard, widely available blood biomarker for this is high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hsCRP.
CRP.
Right. It's a remarkably stable marker of systemic inflammation. And to explain why it's so important, CRP is produced mainly by the liver in response to inflammatory cytokines. These are chemical messengers like IL-6, which are released by activated immune cells all over the body.
And what's causing that?
It's often in response to factors like visceral fat accumulation, lack of sleep, poor diet, or chronic stress.
So it's the body's smoke detector, basically. It's telling us there's a fire somewhere.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. And there are clinical cut points they use to gauge the level of danger.
What are those?
We look at concentrations less than 1 milligram per liter for low cardiovascular risk, 1 to 3 for average risk, and anything greater than 3 milligrams per liter is high risk.
And where does it get really urgent for a doctor?
The real clinical urgency arises when a patient is already on standard therapy, say a statin, and their LDL cholesterol is nice and low, but their hsCRP concentration remains above 2 milligrams per liter.
What does that signal?
That tells the clinician that the patient has an unchecked, persistent inflammatory problem that needs to be targeted directly.
And this shift is now being reflected in major policy. I know the American College of Cardiology recently issued a scientific statement about this.
They did, and it signals a fundamental change in practice. The statement from the ACC endorses universal screening of hsCRP in clinically stable patients.
It's universal screening.
Universal. They're recommending it for both primary and secondary prevention, right alongside traditional markers like LDL-C and another one, the genetic risk factor, LPA.
So it's formally recognizing inflammation as a major actionable risk factor.
Exactly. Not just some sideline finding.
You mentioned LPA in the same breath. For those who aren't familiar, what is that and why is it now being discussed alongside LDL and inflammation?
So LPA, or lipoprotein, is essentially an LDL particle with an extra protein structure attached to it.
Okay.
And unlike traditional LDL, its level is overwhelmingly determined by your genetics. Diet and lifestyle have very little impact on it, but it's both thrombogenic, meaning it promotes clotting, and it's highly inflammatory.
So it's a double threat.
A huge one. High LPA levels signal a severe, often unrecognized, lifelong genetic risk. So grouping it with LDL-C and hsCRP means that cardiologists are now assessing risk using a triple-pronged approach. Standard lipid burden from LDL, genetic risk from LPA, and your current inflammatory status from hsCRP. It moves way beyond just looking at one number.
And identifying this inflammation, it must change not just the testing, but what doctors are actually looking for inside the body.
Absolutely. The biology dictates the strategy. Inflammation orchestrates the entire pathological progression of atherosclerosis.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. It drives the initial damage to the artery lining endothelial dysfunction. It recruits white blood cells to create foam cells. And most critically, it causes the destabilization and rupture of plaques. And that rupture is the immediate cause of most heart attacks.
This has led to a major shift in imaging and diagnosis, moving away from just focusing on obstructive coronary disease.
Yes, the big visible blockages we used to treat with stents.
Right. And now focusing heavily on non-obstructive disease, which is called atheroma.
And this is a really crucial distinction. The kind of plaque that is the most dangerous, what we call the vulnerable plaque, is often non-obstructive.
So it doesn't block the blood flow that much.
Exactly. It doesn't severely limit blood flow, so the patient might even pass a stress test with flying colors. But this vulnerable plaque is characterized by a high inflammatory burden, a high lipid content, a thin fibrous cap, and importantly, it often lacks the dense protective calcification that the old imaging systems relied on to see things.
So the inflammation is what makes it rupture, not necessarily the size of the blockage itself.
That's it. It's the fire, not the plumbing problem.
And technology is catching up to this new understanding. How are cardiologists visualizing this internal fire non-invasively now?
We have these sophisticated tools like non-invasive coronary computed tomography angiography, or CCTA. This gives incredibly high-resolution images of the coronary arteries.
Okay.
And when you couple that with artificial intelligence, specifically using something called the Fat Attenuation Index, or FAI, we get a measure of inflammation we just couldn't access before.
The FAI sounds like something from science fiction. How does it link fat tissue to inflammation in an artery?
It's revolutionary. The FAI works by measuring the density and composition of the perivascular fat. That's the fat tissue immediately surrounding the coronary artery.
Okay.
So when a plaque in the artery is inflamed, it sends out these inflammatory signals, these cytokines, which are then absorbed by that surrounding fat. The FAI measures the density and activity of this fat, and it links it directly to the inflammatory status of the adjacent artery.
And this is predictive.
Highly. Studies have proven that a high FAI score is a powerful predictor of future cardiac mortality. It allows clinicians to actually visualize inflamed plaques and predict risk in a way that focuses on the biology of rupture, not just simple blockage size.
So once that inflammation is identified, you see the high hsCRP or the inflamed plaque with FAI. What are the modern targeted anti-inflammatory therapies that are available beyond just statins?
Well, the therapeutic landscape is expanding really rapidly because we're finally targeting the root cause. One key development is using older drugs in a brand new context.
Such as?
Low-dose colchicine. It's often prescribed at 0.5 milligrams. It's a very old drug, historically used to treat gout.
Gout, which is a severe inflammatory episode.
Exactly. It's a firestorm of inflammation. So the success of colchicine in cardiology really tells us what heart disease is, fundamentally.
And what is that?
It tells us that heart disease is truly a chronic inflammatory condition, almost like an autoimmune response, rather than just a disease of fat deposits.
And the trials back this up.
They do. For patients with stable atherosclerotic disease, low-dose colchicine is now FDA approved, and it cuts ASCVD events by about 25%. But, it requires careful prescribing, it can interact with other drugs, and has to be avoided in patients with significant liver or kidney impairment.
So that's the pharmaceutical intervention. But the ACC statement And just common sense reminds us that the primary anti-inflammatory strategy has to begin with lifestyle changes.
Absolutely. Lifestyle is the ultimate non-pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory lever, and it starts with dietary quality.
Which we're going to get to.
Yes. Prioritizing fruits, vegetables, whole grains, high-quality fats like extra virgin olive oil, while strictly minimizing refined carbs, added sugars, and processed meats. But it extends beyond the plate.
What else?
Regularly aerobic exercise. About 150 minutes of moderate activity a week is potently anti-inflammatory. Quitting smoking is one of the most powerful things a person can do. And managing stress and sleep deprivation, both massive drivers of cytokine release, are just non-negotiable for cooling that chronic fire.
So if the shopper we met just focused on these factors, ditching the sugar and processed oils, improving his sleep, managing his stress, he would be dramatically lowering his inflammatory risk, making his worry about the cholesterol in that egg completely irrelevant.
Completely. And that brings us full circle to the dietary solution. The historical emphasis on single nutrients, fat, cholesterol, it led us astray. Modern health guidance has to center entirely on whole foods and overall dietary patterns for preventing chronic disease.
And the most validated, thoroughly researched dietary pattern that just directly contradicts the historical low-fat dogma is the Mediterranean diet.
It is. It's the antithesis of what those 1980s guidelines promoted.
What are the defining characteristics of that diet?
Its emphasis on vegetables, fruits, whole grains, fish, nuts, and a very high consumption of monounsaturated fatty acids, or MUFAs, that come predominantly from extra virgin olive oil.
And critically, these diets are anything but low-fat.
Anything but. They routinely derive 35% to 40% of their total calories from fat.
40%. That's way above the old 30% limit that was set by those initial guidelines.
Yeah.
So what happened when landmark clinical trials directly tested this high-fat, high-quality approach against the established low-fat controlled diet?
This is where the pre-diamed trial prevention Candieta Mediterranea comes in. It was the primary prevention study that fundamentally forced the medical community to abandon the low-fat dogma.
Tell us about it.
It was a massive undertaking. Over 7,400 participants, all at high cardiovascular risk but with no prior events. And they were randomized into 3 groups. A Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, one supplemented with nuts, or a low-fat controlled diet.
And the results were so overwhelmingly positive that the trial had to be stopped early, right?
That's right. The efficacy was so significant that after a mean follow-up of only 4.8 years, the trial was prematurely halted on ethical grounds. It was deemed unethical to keep withholding the Mediterranean diet from the control group.
Wow. So what did the data show?
The data showed that the groups consuming the Mediterranean diet, whether with olive oil or nuts, saw a substantial 30% relative reduction in the risk of major cardiovascular events.
30%.
30%. Myocardial infarction, stroke, or cardiovascular death. It's a staggering finding, a 30% reduction just from changing the quality of your food without relying on new drugs.
And it had other benefits too, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Beyond that primary outcome, the Mediterranean diet reduced the incidence of type 2 diabetes and provided significant improvements in blood pressure and lipid profiles. It proved, unequivocally, that a high-fat diet is highly cardioprotective as long as the fats are high quality, whole food derived, and used within a pattern rich in plants and fiber.
So Prediment focused on primary prevention people who hadn't had a heart attack yet. What about for patients who already have documented coronary artery disease? Secondary prevention.
That's where the CardioPrev trial comes in. It followed up Prediment brilliantly. It was a long-term, 7-year randomized trial with about 1,000 patients who already had established coronary artery disease. And they randomized them to compare the Mediterranean diet directly against a typical low-fat dietary intervention.
And the long-term verdict.
The conclusion was just as strong as pre-dimed. Over 7 years, the Mediterranean diet was superior to the low-fat diet in the secondary prevention of major cardiovascular events.
So it's settled science, really.
It solidified the fact that for both preventing the first heart attack and preventing subsequent ones, diet quality, specifically a high-fat Mediterranean-style pattern, is the gold standard.
These trials tell us that fat quality matters immensely. So let's break down the specific roles of the major fat types. We know polyunsaturated fats, the PUFAs, are key replacements.
PUFAs, both N6 and N3, are consistently shown to be the most beneficial replacement nutrients for reducing CVD risk. They actively improve blood lipid profiles, they reduce inflammation, and they enhance endothelial function.
And monounsaturated fats, the MUFAs, the star of the show from olive oil.
MUFAs, primarily oleic acid from things like olive oil and avocados, are also highly beneficial. They don't have quite the intense cholesterol-lowering power of PUFAs, but they improve insulin sensitivity, reduce blood pressure, and as we see in the trials, they're associated with a significant decrease in overall heart disease risk when they replace saturated fat or refined carbs.
Okay, let's tackle the long-maligned villain, saturated fat, SFA. Is it still the blanket evil that the 1967 review made it out to be?
The scientific view on SFA is now characterized by nuance and heterogeneity. We've moved far beyond the simplistic SFA bad mantra. The effect of saturated fat is heavily dependent on the food source it comes from and on its specific chemical structure.
Give us an example of this complexity.
Well, we see that protective or even inverse associations with cardiovascular risk are found with SFA that's derived from certain dairy products. This is often linked to the presence of what are called odd-chain saturated fatty acids, like C15.0 and C17.0. And these odd-chain fats have distinct metabolic pathways compared to the more common even-chain fats, and they're sometimes used as biomarkers for high dairy consumption that's associated with lower CVD risk.
So we can't look at a piece of cheese and assign it the same risk profile as a highly processed sausage, even if their total SFA content looks similar on a label.
Absolutely not. This is the concept of the food matrix. The overall food matrix, the combination of specific nutrients, bioactive compounds like probiotics, vitamins, minerals, the physical structure of the food, it all modifies the ultimate health effect of the saturated fat itself.
So yogurt is different.
A yogurt, for example, contains calcium, beneficial fatty acids, sometimes probiotics, all of which change how the body processes that saturated fat, making the overall food potentially neutral or even protective, regardless of its raw SFA count.
So the modern prescription is to stop worrying about SFA in isolation and instead emphasize specific whole foods that are rich in healthy fats, regardless of their total fat content.
That is the evidence-based strategy. We need to focus on what the actual food studies show.
So let's run through the specific evidence on these healthy fat foods.
Okay, starting with nuts. Multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses consistently show that regular nut consumption significantly reduces total cholesterol and LDL-C levels, likely due to their high PUFA and fiber content.
How about the hero of our introduction, the avocado? Our friend should have definitely traded his sugary cereal for one.
He certainly should have. Avocados are powerful. Diets supplemented with avocados have been shown to significantly reduce LDL-C, total cholesterol, and crucially improve the LDL particle number, which is a measure of those small, dense, dangerous LDL particles. And that's compared to calorie-matched low-fat or even moderate-fat diets.
So benefits beyond just the MUFAs.
Far beyond. It suggests benefits that go far beyond their monounsaturated fat composition alone.
And the undisputed champion, extra virgin olive oil.
Extra virgin olive oil it's like a pharmaceutical-grade food. It not only provides healthy MUFAs, but it is packed with phenolic compounds. And these compounds are powerful antioxidants. They have direct anti-inflammatory properties. They reduce blood pressure, and they actively improve biomarkers of vascular wall inflammation. It's a core therapeutic intervention, not just a cooking oil.
And finally, fish, providing those essential N3 fatty acids.
Fish, particularly fatty fish, is the primary source of the long-chain omega-3s, EPA, and DHA. Increasing fish consumption is consistently associated with lower cardiovascular mortality, likely due to their anti-inflammatory effects, their role in regulating heart rhythm, and their positive impact on triglyceride levels.
So we have this mountain of modern evidence that favors high-quality fats and whole food patterns, contradicting this fear narrative that started 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Yet the public confusion persists so dramatically. Our material shows that 64% of consumers are still confused about the role of fats in their diet.
It just speaks to the enduring power of that initial government-sanctioned misinformation campaign. That historical low-fat message is so deeply entrenched. We see that about 60% of consumers still mistakenly believe their fat intake should be less than 14% of their daily calories.
14%, that's radically low.
It's radically low. It's far below the current evidence-based general recommendations of 20% to 35% of total calories. The old message is just stuck, and it's actively harming compliance with good science.
The technical language doesn't really help either.
Yeah.
I mean, we're using terms like MUFA and PUFA, but these chemical terms, they don't resonate with the average consumer as inherently healthy.
No, they don't. Only 16% of consumers, when they were polled, agreed that those chemical terms represented health, even though they recognized the immense benefit of the foods that contain them, like olive oil and nuts.
So what does that tell you?
It reinforces a critical communication mandate for all of us, for healthcare professionals. We have to abandon the focus on total fat reduction and instead emphasize overall diet quality through food-based messaging. We need to start talking about percentages and chemical names and start giving clear, actionable, how-to instructions focused on specific whole foods.
Speaking of percentages, if that total fat limit of 35% was part of the old discredited paradigm, should you, the listener, worry if your healthy whole food diet, rich in olive oil and nuts, pushes you above that 35% limit?
Not in the slightest. The 35% total fat limit has been essentially abandoned in modern guidelines because there's just no robust evidence to support it. The large Women's Health Initiative trial showed no measurable benefit on CVD risk when participants successfully lowered their total fat intake from 36% down to 29%.
So no benefit from cutting fat.
And on the contrary, trials like PREDEMD and OmniHeart, which showed significant benefits, explicitly led participants to consume helpful fats at levels greater than 35% of energy.
So the evidence actually points the other way.
The overwhelming evidence directs us to ignore the percentage of total fat and focus entirely on the quality and the source of the foods you consume.
Okay, let's synthesize all of this into the final actionable prescription for you. Moving beyond the historical confusion, embracing the new inflammatory science, what is the clear path forward for heart health?
The prescription is clear, and it's based entirely on the evidence of chronic disease prevention.
Okay, what's first?
First, emphasize plants. Prioritize fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. This ensures you get high fiber and a lot of bioactive compound intake. Second, prioritize extra virgin olive oil as your primary fat source for its MUFAs and its polyphenols. Third, include fish. Aim for 2 to 3 fatty fish meals per week for those essential EPA and DHA. And finally, and this is maybe the most important,
Go on.
rigorously minimize refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and processed meats, which are the primary drivers of chronic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction.
So the core message is really simple. The true path to heart health is avoiding the processed ingredients, the sugar and the refined oils, managing the underlying inflammation through comprehensive lifestyle choices, and confidently embracing the consumption of natural fats that provide satiety and essential nutrition.
Exactly. We have traced this whole narrative from a calculated, industry-funded fear of fat, which was aimed at maintaining market share for sugar, to the modern, nuanced recognition of chronic inflammation as the primary, modifiable driver of cardiovascular risk.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It is a complete evidence-based paradigm shift in our understanding of health. The historical documentation proves that the public's decades-long fear of fat was, to a significant degree, manufactured and economically driven.
And that's the tragedy we witnessed in the dairy aisle, writ large across the entire nation's nutritional health. The real danger wasn't the cholesterol in the farm-fresh egg that the shopper put back on the shelf. It was the refined sugar and processed oils in the low-fat cereal box he happily tossed into his cart. This knowledge allows you to move beyond those decades of misleading marketing and make truly informed decisions about your heart health and your vitality.